April 11th, 2002. The dictator Hugo Chavez was briefly removed from power in what could have been the start of a golden age for Venezuela. So what happened? Well, it turns out this was actually the first of 3 coups, not one, which took place over a period of 4 days. On April 11th, 2002, Venezuela's opposition parties were planning a march to the presidential palace. They were going to get a bunch of their supporters together and protest and demand that Hugo Chavez resign, because once he got elected after 1998, he not only did his sweeping social programs, but he started a completely new government, restarted the clock on himself as president, and started assuming dictatorial powers, including kicking a bunch of people out of their property. So that is why the opposition was protesting against him, and then he called out the military against unarmed protesters. So on April 11th, 2002, Hugo Chavez activated Plan Avila, and this grossly offended and alienated his top generals, because in 1989, during a series of rioting in the capital city, which had a very strong military crackdown, brutal military crackdown known as El Caracazo, the last administration in Venezuela activated Plan Avila, and they sixed the army on the protesters. And Hugo Chavez vowed while he was campaigning that Plan Avila must never again be allowed to be inflicted on the Venezuelan people. Well, now he was activating Plan Avila because people were protesting against him, and when the military did not obey his orders to crack down on unarmed protesters, he sent his own party's militant supporters to go fight with them and shoot at them. So the military removed him from power. So on the night of April 11th, 2002, Hugo Chavez was on live TV crying about, "They're trying to overthrow me, they're trying to overthrow me." But the media stations showed his live address right next to footage of his supporters shooting at unarmed protesters. And he got a phone call from some of the generals at high command saying, "Hey buddy, it's over, you're under arrest." And then members of his government started fleeing. And that brings us to the wee hours of April 12th. Day 2 of the coup, the day of the second coup. So many members of Chavez's government were either resigning or fleeing at the same time that constitutional succession just plain could not happen. So in the wee hours of the morning, the number 2 guy in the National Chamber of Commerce, Pedro Carmona, ended up being handed the presidency by the armed forces. So many people left that the president of the Chamber of Commerce was the provisional president. So in the wee hours of the morning of April 12th, day 2 of the coup, Diosdado Cabello was hiding inside the Cuban embassy where he had asked for asylum. Now, mind you, nowadays when members of the opposition are hiding inside the embassy of a foreign country, Diosdado Cabello will put it under military siege. But when he's fleeing for his life, he expected people to respect international law. Well, a crowd of protesters grew quickly in front of the Cuban embassy, and they were out for his blood. So opposition mayor Enrique Capriles showed up to try to use his fame and influence to try to get the crowd to leave, and he was eventually successful. Now, eventually he would go to jail and be blamed for instigating the crowd, but that's how Chavismo operates. It's not enough for them to just win. They have to completely humiliate the opposition, so they had to humiliate Capriles anyway. So now we are at the second of the 3 coups of April 2002. Like I said, constitutional succession was not possible, so the military handed the interim presidency, the provisional presidency, to the Chamber of Commerce president, Carmona. Now, what he should have done under the Constitution at the time, the Constitution approved in 1999, was fill up a cabinet out of whatever members of the National Assembly were still there. Most of them would have been opposition members because the Chavistas were still fleeing for their lives that early morning. But instead, he completely dissolved Hugo Chavez's Fifth Republic. He dissolved the National Parliament, the National Assembly, and he declared that the Republic of Venezuela was a thing again. Now, I agree with the principles of his actions, but it was technically a coup. That was the second coup. So, in the wee hours of April 12th, 2002, the armed forces handed over the provisional presidency of Venezuela to Pedro Carmona. Hugo Chavez at first was detained in the presidential palace. The presidential guards and some other military units were planning to shoot it out with anybody who tried to challenge them, but then they saw on TV that the generals were announcing Chavez's resignation was accepted. So they said, oh man, and then that was that, and then they temporarily started supporting the new government. However, instead of filling in the vacancies in the existing Fifth Republic government, Provisional President Carmona instead dissolved it and started naming his friends and people he trusted in positions of power. This was very arbitrary. This was one man's rule. And very foolishly, he did not give any important jobs to any generals or admirals. I say again, he did not give any important jobs to any generals or admirals. Now, it was the military high command that removed Hugo Chavez from the presidency, but President Carmona, well, he just didn't know what he was doing. And because he was being very arbitrary in his appointments, he was being unconstitutional in his appointments, and he was being very vague and mysterious and borderline dictatorial, well, he immediately lost support of the military. So by day 3, April 13th, his coup started falling apart, and people started protesting in the streets. And amazingly enough, the media tried to make a complete blackout. They were trying to salvage the situation because they did not want Chavismo getting any stronger during this crisis. So the media just didn't report on the news for a day. Now, while President Carmona's regime was collapsing after about a day in power, on April 13th, a lot of interesting shenanigans were happening behind the scenes. Now, Hugo Chavez was moved from the presidential palace to Fort Tayuna, which is the armed forces headquarters, and they did not immediately cap him. They did not immediately put him under a kangaroo court. The generals were figuring out what the hell to do with him. They were figuring out whether they wanted to offer him safe passage to Cuba where he could live in exile or not. And because he kept getting conflicting answers and the plan kept changing, Chavez smelled blood. He sensed weakness. So he decided he was going to play his cards right. Also, they were still letting him have conversations with people and make phone calls. So he was coordinating the response of his loyal supporters. And then a couple of Chavista loyalist generals come into play. By nightfall on April 13th, President Carmona's regime had completely collapsed. His ministers and his impromptu appointments were fleeing the country. They were the ones fleeing the country now, not the Chavistas anymore. And a couple of Chavista generals start acting. One of them was a General Garcia Carnero. He sneaks out of Fort Tayuna with a tank, and he drives this tank around areas of Caracas that still strongly supported Hugo Chavez, and he starts instigating Chavistas to come down and march to the streets and come down to the presidential palace and to make some kind of a show of force. And the other player is General Raul Baduel. Raul Baduel starts taking some decisive action on the night of April 13th, which will bring Chavez back to power, but it will eventually be his undoing. The entire time that he's been detained, Hugo Chavez has not been quiet. He's been having conversations. He's been making phone calls and sending messages through different messengers. He's been wheeling and dealing to try to get his life spared instead of being sent to exile to try to get back into power. Then two generals in particular were highly influential in restoring him to power. One was Garcia Carnero, who stole a tank and went around Caracas mobilizing Chavistas to come down and protest in his favor. The other one was Raul Baduel, the paratrooper commander over in Maracay. He said that his forces would personally be removing Hugo Chavez from arrest at Fort Tayuna, and they would be bringing him back to the presidential palace. Well, nobody wanted to shoot it out with the paratroopers, so by nightfall of the third day of the coups, when the third coup was underway, Carmona fled with the rest of his administration. So General Raul Baduel is the one who saved the Bolivarian Revolution. He is the man who personally reinstated Hugo Chavez back into power. During the few interim hours between Baduel's announcement and Chavez actually being back in Miraflores Palace, Diosdado Cabello emerged from hiding at the Cuban embassy to be sworn in as the caretaker president until Chavez arrived on the wee hours of April 14th, the fourth and final day of the three coups. Now, the big irony, Baduel was elevated. He did serve as Minister of Defense for years, and he has gone down in the Chavista pantheon as a hero. But the irony is, Hugo Chavez's hand-picked successor is the one who threw General Baduel in prison, where Baduel died because Maduro was afraid of him. If General Baduel had not acted to reinstate Hugo Chavez in power, it is entirely possible that the Bolivarian Revolution would have ended once and for all on April 11th, 2002. But that's not what happened. The rest is history. The opposition tried different protest tactics for 2 more years, including a recall referendum to try to get Hugo Chavez to leave power, but he would not leave. He made it abundantly clear that he would not leave, at least not peacefully. And it took death to remove him from the presidency. But yes, his hand-picked successor, Nicolas Maduro, put Baduel in prison, fearing that Baduel was really the only one who had the pull with the military to overthrow Maduro. And he was probably absolutely right. So, when he saved Chavez, Baduel signed his own death warrant because he died in prison.